If I told you a country had nearly 100% of its kids enrolled in primary school,
Right.
and its gross domestic product was growing at like a steady 5% a year.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah, and it had this massive young working age population, you would probably look at that and say, that country is an absolute economic miracle.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone would.
You'd look at those headline numbers and just assume they are on the fast track to unparalleled prosperity. But what if I told you that underneath those very specific numbers, that exact same country's economic architecture is actually on the verge of total irreversible collapse?
Yeah, that's the real story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at 60 years of global data to find out why the numbers we see on the evening news are, well, almost always lying to us by omission.
And, I mean, that omission is rarely malicious. It's not some grand conspiracy. It just happens because we are conditioned to look at a nation's development through a very, very narrow lens.
Like looking through a keyhole.
Exactly. We celebrate when a single metric goes up,
Yeah.
right? Without understanding the vast interconnected machinery that's actually operating beneath the surface. To really understand what makes a society thrive or fail, you have to look at the entire blueprint.
Which is exactly what we are going to do with you today. So to you, the listener joining us right now, get ready, because the sheer scale of the source material we're jumping into is staggering.
It really is.
We're looking at a multidimensional data set tracking global macroeconomic and social development indicators from 1960 all the way to 2024.
Over 6 decades of human history.
Yeah, quantified across more than 300 distinct data points for almost every nation on Earth. I mean, it is an ocean of rows and columns.
Which can be overwhelming.
Totally. So to make sense of this, we've translated this massive data set into a mental presentation for you, a visual slide deck that we are going to just walk through together.
It's really the only way to synthesize this much information. Because data without a narrative structure is, well, it's just noise.
Right. And I want to be very specific about the visual aesthetic I'm imagining for this mental slide deck, because the design itself reflects the rigor of the data. Picture a perfectly minimalist presentation.
Very clean.
Pure, pristine white background. Like the hex code is FFFFFF for the designers out there.
Even clutter.
Exactly. There are no distracting 3D graphics, no drop shadows, no flashy high saturation colors. We are looking at pure, flat information. The charts are constructed using dark grays and light grays, with maybe a single low saturation dark red or deep blue line to draw your eye.
Just highlighting what matters.
Right, and we might use a hand-drawn circle exactly where the data tells a critical story. Every single page we discuss has a clear, unavoidable core insight, like a key takeaway text box that anchors the logic.
So if you imagine the first visual on that pure white canvas, it's our cover slide. The title is Macroeconomic and Social Development Multidimensional Indicator System Analysis Report.
Rolls right off the tongue.
Doesn't it? But at the bottom of this slide, there is this very fine line, abstract, multidimensional data radar chart. And it really serves as our mission statement. A nation's development is a precision gear system. If you strip one gear, say, environmental sustainability, the entire machine eventually grinds to a halt, no matter how fast the economic gear is spinning.
That makes perfect sense. So let's turn to the second slide. This is our narrative logic and framework. I'm visualizing a flat, elegant tree mind map. It breaks down this massive gear system into 4 main dimensions that we're going to explore today.
Right, the 4 pillars.
We have economy and governance, society and human capital, health and infrastructure, and finally, environment and sustainability. It's a complete structural walkthrough of a nation.
And we have to begin with the foundation. So the third slide in our deck focuses on the economic cornerstone, right? National income and growth momentum. The visual here is a combination of a stepped line chart and a waterfall graph. The most prominent lines track gross domestic product GDP, measured in constant 2015 US dollars to, strip out the illusion of inflation.
Smart.
Yeah, and that's alongside gross national income, or GNI, per capita growth rates.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because we see GDP everywhere. It is like the ultimate scoreboard metric for a country. But as we established earlier, staring only at the GDP line is super dangerous.
That's a trap.
When I look at the historical panel data from 1960 to 2024, I see massive volatility in growth rates for a lot of developing nations. I mean, the line spikes up, crashes down, flatlines, then spikes again.
And that volatility exposes the structural fragility of a nation's growth. A country might have a phenomenal 5-year run because Say, global copper prices skyrocketed,
Right.
or because they discovered a new offshore oil reserve. That makes the GDP line surge. But the crucial question is what the country actually does with that temporary windfall.
Which brings us to a really important metric on this slide, highlighted with a dark red arrow, right? Gross capital formation as a percentage of GDP.
Yes, gross capital formation.
Okay, that sounds like something an investment banker mutters in their sleep. Let's ground that in reality.
Yeah.
What does capital formation look like when you, walk down the street?
It looks like concrete pouring.
Okay.
It looks like miles of new fiber optic cable being laid under the sidewalks. It's the purchase of advanced MRI machines for hospitals, the construction of deep-water ports, and importing high-precision manufacturing robotics.
Physical stuff.
Physical and intellectual accumulation of productive assets. That is gross capital formation.
So if a country hits an oil boom and uses that cash to, I don't know, subsidize imported luxury cars and cheap consumer electronics for its population, the GDP looks great this year, but the capital formation metric just stays flat.
That is the exact mechanism. They are living paycheck to paycheck on a national scale. By contrast, if a nation takes that exact same oil revenue and builds a world-class technical university and a high-speed rail network, they are converting temporary liquid wealth into permanent structural capacity.
Oh, I see.
That is gross capital formation. So our stepped line chart uses a dark dashed circle to highlight these specific cycles, periods where economic growth either successfully translates into capital formation or tragically fails to do so. Capital formation is the true engine pulling the economy forward into the next decade.
Which means a country can't just rely entirely on its own domestic engine forever, right? It has to connect to the rest of the world.
Exactly.
Let's move to the fourth slide. We're looking at a horizontal bar chart paired with a minimalist flow map showing international trade. This is all about global integration. The raw data shows the absolute volume of merchandise exports and imports. But I'm looking at these numbers, and something doesn't add up.
What do you mean?
Well, a country could export millions of tons of unprocessed bauxite, which is basically just raw dirt with aluminum in it, and their export volume would be massive. But does shipping dirt mean a country is actually integrated into the global economy?
No. And what's fascinating here is the data tells us that volume is essentially an illusion without complexity. Shipping raw bauxite doesn't require a sophisticated domestic economy. It just requires shovels and ships.
Right.
If the global price of bauxite drops, that country's economy collapses overnight. So the data set forces us to look past raw tonnage and zeroes in on a very specific indicator: high technology exports as a percentage of manufactured exports.
High-tech exports. So we're talking about, what, aerospace equipment, pharmaceuticals?
Precision optical electronics, yeah.
Yeah.
Things that require intense intellectual property.
Stuff you can't just dig out of the ground.
And things you absolutely cannot fake.
Yeah.
To export high-tech goods, you need a highly educated workforce, a super stable electrical grid, complex logistics, rigorous quality control.
Yeah.
And we pair that metric with another critical data point on this slide, circled with a fine hand-drawn line: foreign direct investment, or FDI, net inflows as a percentage of GDP.
Let's clarify FDI for the listener, because when people hear investment, they might picture like hedge funds buying stocks on a screen and selling them 3 seconds later. That's hot money. It flies in and out. Foreign direct investment is different, isn't it?
It is entirely different. FDI is patient capital. It means an international, multinational corporation is physically building a manufacturing plant in your country or buying a substantial, lasting stake in a domestic enterprise.
They're laying down roots.
They're pouring foundation. When you combine strong FDI net inflows with a rising percentage of high-tech exports, you're looking at the ultimate litmus test for a nation's depth of integration into global value chains. It means the international community trusts that nation to be a critical, reliable link in their most complex operations.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, if an aerospace company builds a turbine factory in your country, they aren't going to pack up and leave next month just because the currency dipped a little. They're locked in.
Exactly. They have skin in the game.
But to attract that kind of patient capital, you need a playing field that foreign investors can actually trust. Which brings us to slide 5. We are transitioning from the economic outputs to the institutional framework. The visual here is a very sharp, flat, hexagonal radar chart. No shading, just crisp gray lines. This is the institutional moat, the rules of the game.
And those rules are quantified here through the Be Ready or Business Ready scores. This data set breaks down the regulatory environment into specific pillars: We're looking at the quality of labor regulations, the operational efficiency of tax administration, and the services that promote market competition.
Okay, let's play out a scenario here to make this real. Let's say a country has a young, eager workforce in a geographic location that's just perfect for shipping. They really want to attract that foreign direct investment. A global logistics company decides they want to build a massive automated warehouse near the capital. But when they look at the Be Ready score for business entry and tax administration, the numbers are just abysmal. What does that actually mean on the ground for that company?
On the ground, it means that just to get the permit to clear the land, the company has to navigate 6 different uncoordinated government ministries.
Ah, a nightmare.
Right. It means the tax code is so deliberately opaque that the company cannot accurately project its liabilities, which forces them to hire politically connected consultants just to operate. It means the process takes 3 years instead of 3 months.
And so the logistics company simply looks at a neighboring country with a better Be Ready score and builds the warehouse there instead. The original country loses out on thousands of jobs, massive capital formation, technological spillover all because of administrative friction.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that friction is quantified on this slide through 2 overarching indices, the control of corruption, percentile ranking, and the government effectiveness estimate. We use annotated arrows here to correlate the micro-level Be Ready scores with these macro-level rankings.
Okay.
And it's important to note, control of corruption doesn't just measure the absence of bribes. It measures how much public power is exercised for private gain.
It's fascinating to see corruption treated not just as a moral or legal issue, but as a severe macroeconomic headwind.
Because in economic terms, corruption is an unrecorded, unpredictable tax on every single transaction. Transparent and highly efficient institutional arrangements are the absolute prerequisites for lowering transaction costs and sparking market vitality. If a market is plagued by corruption, the transaction costs become so high that they kill market vitality before it even sparks. Legitimate businesses just cannot compete with businesses that simply bribe their way out of safety regulations or tax obligations.
So if the government institutions are the load-bearing walls of this architecture, the financial system is the internal plumbing. It's how resources actually move through the building.
That's a great way to put it.
Let's look at slide 6. Financial capillaries and credit distribution. I'm picturing a vast bubble scatter plot on our pure white background. The data points represent the percentage of the population, ages 15 and older, with an account at a financial institution or a mobile money service provider.
This metric is profound because it shifts our perspective from the macro level of government ministries down to the daily reality of individual citizens.
Right.
Think of the economy as a body. A central bank and massive multinational corporations are the heart and the major arteries. But these individual local bank accounts and mobile money wallets are the capillaries.
And if the blood doesn't reach the fingertips, the body fails.
The dataset is incredibly precise about where we need to look to check the health of this network. We don't just look at total account ownership, because that average can be artificially inflated by the wealthy middle class holding multiple accounts.
Oh, sure.
We must isolate the specific metric for account ownership among the poorest 40% of the population.
Let's explore why that specific segment matters so much. Imagine a rural farmer in a developing nation. He operates entirely in cash. He keeps his savings under a floorboard. He has no financial capillary connecting him to the larger economy. What happens when a drought hits and he needs to buy an irrigation pump?
Well, because he is unbanked, he has no formalized financial history. He cannot walk into a commercial bank branch and secure a loan based on his past 3 years of crop yields because those yields were never recorded in a ledger.
They just don't exist on paper.
Exactly. His only option is the informal shadow economy. A local moneylender charging predatory interest rates, perhaps 50 or 60%. The cost of capital for this farmer is so astronomically high that he cannot afford the pump. His crops fail, he remains in poverty.
Now contrast that with a farmer in a country that has prioritized financial inclusion. He uses a basic mobile money app on a cheap smartphone to receive payments for his crops.
That changes the entire mathematical equation of his life. Even if it's just a mobile wallet, he is now generating a digital footprint. He is part of the formal system.
Wow.
Based on that digital transaction history, a microfinance institution can extend him a small line of credit at a reasonable interest rate to buy that solar water pump. He buys the pump, his yields increase, he saves the surplus in his secure digital account, and his family experiences upward economic mobility.
On our scatter plot, we use marker lines to connect this human-level account ownership with the structural data, domestic credit provided by the financial sector as a percentage of GDP, alongside the sheer physical presence of the system, measured by the number of commercial bank branches and ATMs per 100,000 adults.
Hmm.
Because if you don't build out those financial capillaries, a vast portion of your population is effectively locked out of the modern economy.
The data proves that the ability of formal financial services to penetrate the lower socioeconomic classes strictly determines the baseline of economic mobility.
Which provides the perfect transition to the next dimension of our framework. We've built the economic foundation and the institutional walls, and we've laid down the financial plumbing. Now we have to look at the people living and working inside the structure.
The human element.
Slide 7 takes us into society and human capital. The focus here is the labor force structure. The visual is a crisp, stacked bar chart showing the labor force participation rate for the population aged 15 to 64.
This slide visualizes the tectonic plates of demographics. For decades, many rapidly developing economies relied heavily on what we call the demographic dividend.
Right.
This occurs when a country experiences a massive bulge in its population pyramid of young, working-age people relative to a smaller number of elderly dependents.
It's an enormous injection of raw labor power. More people working, fewer people to take care of.
But the longitudinal data from 1960 to 2024 offers a stark warning. The demographic dividend is strictly temporary. Populations inevitably age, the birth rate drops, life expectancy increases, and suddenly that bulge of workers becomes a massive cohort of retirees needing pensions and healthcare.
And math flips on them.
It does. To sustain economic growth long-term, a nation must transition from relying on a demographic dividend, having a vast quantity of hands, to a talent dividend, having highly skilled, highly productive minds.
But looking at the data on this slide, there is a very dark gray warning section of the stacked bar chart that shows where this transition is catastrophically failing. It tracks the NEET rate, NET youth ages 15 to 24 who are not in education, employment, or training.
The NEET rate is one of the most concerning indicators in the entire global data set. It represents millions of young people who are entirely parked. They are completely disconnected from the formal machinery of the nation.
It's idle potential. But right next to that dark gray block, there is a stark, jagged red warning arrow pointing to another metric that seems to totally contradict it. Child employment in agriculture and manufacturing, specifically ages 7 to 14. Wait, how can a modern economy reconcile these extremes? Massive idle youth on one hand and exploited children working in factories on the other.
It seems like a paradox, but an impartial reading of this data reveals that both extremes are symptoms of severe structural failure. The high NEET rate, this vast pool of idle youth, and in many regions, female labor idle time, represents a massive invisible opportunity cost to society. Is potential energy bleeding away?
Yeah.
And historically, a high concentration of unemployed, uneducated youth is a leading indicator for profound social unrest.
And the child labor metric.
The presence of children aged 7 to 14 in the workforce indicates a level of structural poverty so deep that families simply cannot survive without the immediate caloric output of their children's physical labor.
Which inherently means those 7 and 10-year-olds are not sitting in a classroom.
And that is the tragedy quantified by the data. Child labor solves a short-term household survival problem, but it permanently undercuts the future human capital of the nation. You are essentially consuming your seed corn just to make it through the winter.
That's bleak.
A country will never reach that high-tech talent dividend we discussed earlier if its 10-year-olds are picking cotton or sorting recycling instead of learning basic mathematics.
That immediately begs the question about the kids who are in the classroom. Slide 8 brings us to intellectual investment and education. The visualization here is a funnel chart demonstrating the attrition rate from initial enrollment to actual skill acquisition. We look at the top of the funnel, which is the adjusted net primary school enrollment rate. In many countries, even those struggling economically, this number is incredibly high, often in the upper 90s.
Governments and international organizations have been remarkably successful at getting children into physical school buildings. But the top of the funnel only measures attendance.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting. I'm looking at the data as we move down this funnel. If enrollment is at 98%, why does the lower secondary completion rate drop off a cliff? And more importantly, there is a bright red circle here highlighting a metric called learning poverty. So kids are sitting at desks. Does that mean they are actually learning?
Often, no. Learning poverty is defined as the share of children at the end of primary school age who cannot read and understand a simple text. They are below the minimum threshold for reading proficiency.
Wait, really? After years of school?
Yes. To understand the mechanism behind it, you have to look at how education is actually delivered. A government might build a physical school to satisfy an international development goal. But if they don't have the tax revenue or institutional effectiveness to pay teachers a living wage, you end up with massive teacher absenteeism.
Because the teacher has to go work a second job in the informal market just to feed their own family?
Exactly. Furthermore, if the children are suffering from chronic malnutrition, their cognitive development is stunted. They cannot focus, even if the teacher is present. So you have a situation where a 10-year-old sits in a pristine classroom for 5 years, but because of absenteeism, lack of materials, and poor health, they never actually learn to read the chalkboard.
Being in school absolutely does not equal learning. That is a devastating distinction. And the economic ripple effects must be massive.
They are absolute. A country with a high learning poverty rate has a hard ceiling clamped onto its economic future. The gears jam. You cannot participate in global value chains, you cannot attract that patient foreign direct investment, and you certainly cannot produce high-tech exports if the bulk of your future workforce cannot read a basic instructional manual.
It shows how human biology and cognition are the ultimate raw materials of an economy. Which brings us to slide 9, the defense line of life. This covers public health infrastructure and interventions. We have a very stark dual-axis line chart here. On one axis, we are tracking medical infrastructure inputs. On the other axis, we track survival rates.
Over the 60 years of data, the correlation here is one of the most mathematically undeniable. When you plot physical infrastructure inputs, specifically the number of hospital beds per 1,000 people and the number of physicians per 1,000 people against health outputs like the under-5 mortality rate and the maternal mortality ratio, the relationship is absolute.
Yeah.
Higher density of medical infrastructure directly drives down infant and maternal death.
It makes intuitive sense. More doctors and more beds available during a complicated childbirth means the mother and the baby survive. But there is a specific metric on this slide, highlighted with a directed arrow, that shifts this from a purely medical conversation to an economic one. It's the risk of impoverishing expenditure for surgical care.
This raises an important question, right? Because medical infrastructure isn't just about the physical hospital. It is about the financial architecture that allows a citizen to access that hospital. This is a vital indicator of a society's resilience.
Let's put a human face on this metric. Let's go back to our farmer who finally got the microloan, bought the solar pump, increased his crop yield, and managed to pull his family just above the poverty line. He's doing well, he's building savings. Then his teenage son gets in an accident and shatters his femur, requiring emergency orthopedic surgery.
If that country lacks a robust public health safety net or affordable social insurance, the farmer is hit with catastrophic out-of-pocket surgical costs. To pay the hospital bill, he has to drain his mobile money savings, he has to sell the solar water pump, he might even have to pull his other children out of school to work in the fields to make up for the lost labor.
In a matter of days, one broken bone instantly undoes 5 years of agonizing economic progress. The family drops right back below the extreme poverty line.
That is the terror quantified by the risk of impoverishing surgical expenditure. It exposes the utter fragility of the social safety net. It means that the rising middle class is an illusion, always just one car accident or one appendectomy away from destitution.
Wow.
A nation cannot build a resilient, forward-looking economy on top of a population that lives in constant rational terror of getting sick.
That perfectly bridges the gap between biological health and the physical environment people rely on. Let's move to slide 10. This covers physical interconnectivity, infrastructure, energy, and digitalization. The visual is an area chart mapping access over time combined with iconography. We start by looking at basic access to electricity, broken down to show the disparity between rural and urban populations.
For a large portion of the 20th century, electrification was the ultimate proxy for development. When a rural area gained access to electricity, the data showed immediate cascading spikes in productivity, health outcomes, and education. Children could study after dark, clinics could refrigerate vaccines, and small businesses could operate machinery.
But when I look at the area chart moving into the 2010s and 2020s, the electricity access lines start to plateau near the top for many nations. The new lines surging upward on the chart are fixed broadband subscriptions and individuals using the internet. It seems like the definition of basic infrastructure has fundamentally shifted.
It has. Electricity used to be the luxury, the great differentiator. Now, broadband connectivity is the water and air of the modern economy.
If you don't have it, you can't breathe.
Exactly. If a rural population has electric lights but no broadband internet, they are still economically suffocating. The digital divide is actively and aggressively reshaping global inequality. You cannot integrate a rural artisan into the global digital marketplace if they cannot connect to it.
But the data on this slide also reminds us that the digital world still relies on the physical world. I'm looking at the arrows pointing to container port traffic, measured in TEU's 20-foot equivalent units, and the Logistics Performance Index, or LPI. Why pair high-speed internet with cargo ships on the same slide?
Because digital speed is useless without physical speed.
Yeah.
Let's say a domestic manufacturer receives a digital order for 1,000 circuit boards from a buyer in Europe. The transaction happens in milliseconds over that new broadband connection.
Right.
But to fulfill the order, the manufacturer has to import specialized silicon. If the nation's ports are bogged down by outdated analog customs processes, dilapidated cranes, and poor road networks leading inland, that silicon sits in a shipping container for 3 weeks instead of 3 days.
And the manufacturer's capital is tied up in that idle container. The European buyer gets frustrated with the delay and shifts their next order to a country with a higher logistics performance index.
Precisely. The data shows that physical and digital infrastructure must advance in lockstep. If your digital pathways are gigabit speed but your physical ports are clogged, the economy chokes.
Speaking of choking, we need to confront the physical limits of the planet we are building all this infrastructure on. Slide 11 takes us into our fourth dimension, environment and sustainability. We are looking at the environmental footprint. The visual is a comparative bar chart showing positive and negative forces emissions versus clean energy. We are tracking total and per capita CO2 emissions, breaking them down by sector, like energy, transport, agriculture.
If you look at the historical data from the 1960s through the 1990s, there was this strict, linear relationship between wealth and pollution. If a nation's GDP went up, their carbon emissions went up in almost exact parallel. Economic growth fundamentally required burning massive amounts of fossil fuels.
Let's picture a manufacturing town during that era. New factories are built, GDP surges, wages go up, but the sky is thick with coal smoke. The air quality is terrible, but the residents accept it because smoke meant paychecks. But the data suggests that mandate has to change.
The absolute necessity for any maturing modern economy is decoupling. A mature economy must decouple its economic growth from its carbon emissions. The GDP line must continue its upward trajectory while the CO2 emission line flattens and eventually drops.
And are we actually seeing that decoupling in the panel data?
We are, in select economies. To track this, we look at the positive data points highlighted on this slide. The percentage of total energy use coming from alternative and nuclear energy, and the electricity production from renewable sources. When those specific metrics climb concurrently with GDP, a nation is proving that sustainable, decoupled prosperity is mechanically possible. They are powering the factories with solar, wind, and nuclear energy instead of coal.
But carbon in the atmosphere is only half the ecological story. We also have to look at the ground beneath our feet. Slide 12 is about nature's carrying capacity, land use, and water security. I want you to picture a minimalist, flat map of the world overlaid with a stark ring chart. I am looking at a metric here that is circled with a bright warning highlight, level of water stress.
That metric is defined as the ratio of fresh water withdrawn by a nation compared to its total available renewable freshwater resources.
Put simply, how much water are we sucking out of the rivers and underground aquifers compared to how much the rain naturally replenishes? And for some of the countries on this map, that number is terrifyingly high.
We synthesize this water stress data with the agricultural and forest land percentages, the fossil fuel consumption rates, and the PM 2.5 air pollution exposure. When you view all these metrics together, an impartial reading of the data presents an unavoidable physical conclusion. Over-extracting resources is pushing development toward a hard, ecological red line.
Consider an agricultural region that relies on deep well irrigation. They are pumping water out of the aquifer 10 times faster than the rain replaces it. The water stress metric is flashing red. What happens when they hit the bottom of the well?
The agricultural sector collapses. And you cannot negotiate with an empty aquifer. In economics, you can restructure sovereign debt, you can negotiate trade tariffs, you can alter tax policy, but you cannot negotiate with physics and biology.
Yeah, nature doesn't care about your GDP.
Exactly. If water stress hits 100%, the land undergoes subsidence, the soil turns to dust, and the agricultural gear in our national machine shatters. And when the ability to feed the population shatters, the entire economic and social structure built above it comes crashing down. The ecological baseline is the ultimate, non-negotiable foundation of the entire data matrix.
It is a sobering reality check. Economics is ultimately bound by the laws of thermodynamics. So let's look at how society operates within those physical boundaries. Slide 13 moves us into social equity and multidimensional poverty. We are talking about fractures and the redistribution of wealth. The visual here combines a Lorenz curve and a histogram. We are graphing the Gini index, which measures income inequality, and we are directly comparing the income share held by the highest 10% of the population against the lowest 20%.
We discussed earlier how a nation's GDP and GNI per capita can rise significantly over a decade. Total wealth is increasing.
So what does this all mean for you and me? If the country is objectively richer, why do the social metrics often show increasing anger and instability?
Well, the mechanics of inequality explain the anger. Impartially addressing the data here. When absolute wealth increases, when the GDP gear is spinning furiously, but the nation lacks an effective mechanism for wealth redistribution, the system fractures. It drastically deepens social fractures.
By redistribution mechanism, you mean a fair tax system, or those financial capillaries we talked about earlier that allow the poorest to access credit.
Exactly. Without those mechanisms, the newly generated wealth concentrates almost entirely at the top. The highest 10% capture all the gains of the economic growth.
Imagine a factory worker who has been doing the same job for 10 years. The country's GDP has grown by 50% in that time, but the workers' wages, adjusted for inflation, haven't moved a single cent. Meanwhile, they walk out of the factory and see luxury high-rise condominiums being built across the street and foreign sports cars driving past them. Even if that worker isn't technically starving, the data shows this widened gap creates a massive sense of relative deprivation.
Relative deprivation is a potent destructive force. It breaks the social contract. And the ultimate tracker of whether the economic poverty reduction process is actually working for the bottom tier is the poverty gap at $3 a day metric. Notice that it's not just a head count of who is poor, it measures the depth of the poverty.
Right, because a head count treats someone making $2.90 the same as someone making 50 cents. They are both in poverty, but the poverty gap measures how far below the line they are,
Which dictates the intensity of the policy intervention required to save them. If your GDP is growing at 5% a year but your poverty gap isn't shrinking, your economic machine is fundamentally misaligned. It is generating immense heat and wealth at the top, but providing zero forward motion for the majority.
Which brings us to the most significant structural exclusion in the entire dataset. Slide 14, inclusive development and gender parity. The focus here is a parallel dumbbell chart. It's a striking visual two dots connected by a horizontal line, demonstrating the narrowing, or unfortunately in some cases, the widening gap between men and women.
The data set forces us to analyze the proportion of seats held by women in national parliaments and the ratio of female labor force participation rate compared to men.
The raw economic argument here is undeniable. If a nation systematically excludes half of its population from formal labor and political decision-making, it is voluntarily operating its economy at a maximum of 50% capacity.
It is a massive, unreleased catalyst for societal potential.
But what about the work that isn't on a standard payroll? I'm looking at that formal labor force participation rate, and I see a massive blind spot. The metric only counts formal, monetized employment women receiving a standard paycheck.
You've hit on one of the most crucial nuances in macroeconomic analysis. The most sophisticated readings of this dataset account for that exact blind spot by tracking deep-seated, unmonetized inequalities. Specifically, the data highlights with a dashed box the disproportionate amount of time women spend on unpaid domestic and care work.
Think about a woman in a developing region who spends 3 hours a day walking to fetch clean water, and another 3 hours caring for elderly parents and raising children. That is 6 hours of exhausting, absolutely necessary labor. If she stopped doing it, the entire formal economy would collapse overnight because the men wouldn't be able to go to the factories. Yet her 6 hours of daily labor are entirely invisible to the GDP calculation.
It is invisible labor that subsidizes the visible economy. And the data set also forces us to confront the severe incidence of violence against women. When you factor in the invisible burden of unpaid care work alongside the physical and psychological toll of systemic violence, you realize that achieving true gender parity isn't merely a matter of adjusting hiring quotas.
Yeah, it goes way deeper.
It requires restructuring the entire social architecture to value, monetize, and protect half of the population. Full economic and political participation of women is framed as a massive, unreleased catalyst for societal potential. It's arguably the single most powerful, underutilized economic engine on the planet.
It fundamentally changes how you view the labor happening in every household. Okay, we have walked through the entire mental slide deck. We've examined the foundational GDP and capital formation, navigated the institutional moats and financial capillaries, scrutinized learning poverty and surgical costs, bumped up against the hard ecological red lines, and exposed the deep fractures of inequality and gender disparity. It is time for the final slide. Slide 15, the conclusion and policy matrix.
The visual backdrop of our deck is cleared. There are no more line charts, no more scatter plots, just pure white space.
Just a simple, minimalist 2x2 quadrant matrix plotting impact against urgency. There are no numbers here, just 4 gray text boxes with small arrows pointing to policy priorities. How do we possibly synthesize 60 years of data across 300 indicators into a final conclusion?
The overarching theme that emerges from this entire analysis is a paradigm shift. Data is not the destination. Data is the navigation system. For decades, policymakers used data to blindly chase a single destination, which was almost always a higher GDP.
But as we've seen, if you just slam your foot on the gas pedal to chase GDP, you might drive your national vehicle right off an ecological cliff, or you might realize half your passengers have been thrown out of the car into extreme poverty along the way.
Precisely why modern governance requires synthesis. The matrix directs us to look at aggregated, holistic metrics. Two of the most critical are the Human Capital Index, or HCI, and the CPIA ratings.
Let's break those down. The Human Capital Index, how does it work?
The HCI calculates the contributions of health and education to worker productivity. It results in a score between 0 and 1. If a country scores a 0.4, it means that children born today will only be 40% as productive in adulthood as they could have been if they'd enjoyed complete education and full health. It mathematically proves that funding schools and hospitals is not a charitable expense. It is the ultimate capital investment.
And the CPIA?
That stands for country policy, an institutional assessment. It judges the actual quality of a nation's policies regarding economic management, structural policies, social inclusion, and environmental equity. It rates how well the government's rules actually support sustainable poverty reduction. The crucial takeaway from our final slide is that modern policy must radically pivot. Governments have to stop chasing single economic metrics and start making comprehensive, interlocking investments. You must invest in the ecological boundaries. You must build transparent institutional frameworks that reduce friction. And above all, you must invest in the cognitive and physical health of human beings.
Because a nation is a precision gear system. If the humans inside the system are broken, sick, uneducated, or marginalized, the gear seize up and the machine stops entirely.
That is the undeniable logic of the data.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, provocative thought to mull over. We have just spent this time proving how incredibly granular our measurement of society has become. We can track everything from a nation's high-tech export percentage to a 10-year-old's reading proficiency, from atmospheric CO2 distribution down to the exact number of ATMs per 100,000 adults. We have built the ultimate dashboard. So are we moving toward a future where algorithmic governance could automatically adjust national policies based on these real-time data feeds?
That heavy thought.
Imagine an AI system that automatically reallocates federal tax revenue the exact second the learning poverty rate ticks up by 0.5% in a specific province. It sounds efficient. But if we do move toward that automated, data-driven governance, who decides which metric matters most when the gears inevitably start to grind against each other? When a system has to choose between maintaining an aggressive, high-tech export quota to satisfy international markets and forcibly shutting down factories to prevent a local water aquifer from running completely dry, who writes the code that makes that choice?
That is the ultimate question of the next century. The data gives us a perfect blueprint of the architecture, but it doesn't decide what kind of house we actually want to live in.
It is still up to us to interpret the numbers and decide what we value. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense, multidimensional deep dive into the global architecture. I hope the next time you see a news headline shouting about a 2% rise in GDP, you look right past it. You look for the gross capital formation. You look for the learning poverty rate. You look for the water stress. Keep questioning the numbers and keep looking for the invisible architecture. We'll see you next time.